My name is Eleanor, though most people at work call me Nora because it sounds lighter, easier to say, easier to interrupt. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've worked behind the scenes, operations, coordination, the kind of role where things either run smoothly or fall apart, and no one ever asks why. If you met me back then, you might have described me as calm, competent, and forgettable in the way people often mean as a compliment. The reliable one. The one who doesn't cause trouble. People usually assumed I was agreeable because I didn't raise my voice. They assumed I lacked ambition because I didn't advertise it. And they assumed I didn't notice things because I didn't react in the moment. What they missed was that silence isn't emptiness. Sometimes it's storage. This isn't a story about revenge. There's no dramatic takedown, no shouting match, no viral email thread. It's a story about time, attention, and the quiet moment when you realize the room you're standing in has been making decisions about you without your consent. It's about what happens when you stop trying to correct those assumptions out loud and start correcting them internally. The emotional journey here isn't explosive. It's gradual. It begins with belonging, shifts into confusion, then into a very specific kind of clarity. The kind that doesn't make you angry, but precise. You'll hear about small moments that didn't seem important at the time, patterns that only became visible in hindsight, and one ordinary afternoon when I opened my laptop and saw something that permanently changed how I understood my place in that company. I found my job description on LinkedIn while I was still employed, and underneath it, in clean bullet points that mirrored my daily responsibilities almost perfectly, was a line that made my chest go quiet instead of tight. It said, "Immediate start." What follows isn't about exposing anyone or proving I was right all along. It's about what it feels like to be slowly edited out of a role you helped build and what it means to respond without theatrics. I'm telling this the way it happened, plainly, honestly, without dressing it up as triumph or victimhood, because I think many people have experienced a version of this without having language for it. If you've ever sensed a shift before it was announced, or felt yourself becoming optional in a place that once depended on you, you might recognize some of what I'm about to share. And before we go any further, I want to ask you something gently, without expectation. Have you ever realized you were being replaced? Not loudly, but quietly, and wondered when you were supposed to start choosing yourself? To them, I was steady background noise, the hum of something essential but unremarkable, like the electricity in the walls. No one praises the wiring unless it fails, and because I never failed loudly, I rarely existed loudly either. In meetings, I was the one who took notes even when it wasn't officially my role. I remembered decisions others forgot they'd made. I followed up on loose ends that didn't belong to anyone else. When timelines held, it was assumed they always would. When projects shipped on time, credit floated upward, bypassing my desk entirely, as if efficiency were a natural resource rather than something maintained daily by a human being. If someone had asked my manager who I was, they would have said, "Nora's great, very dependable." That was the word that followed me everywhere. Dependable, not strategic, not insightful. Dependable, like a good chair. You only notice it when it breaks. I didn't resent this at first. I had been raised to believe that good work speaks for itself. If you stayed focused, kept your head down, and delivered consistently, recognition would arrive on its own schedule. I believed competence had gravity, that eventually it would pull attention toward it. So when conversations happened without me, about processes I designed, clients I onboarded, workflows I refined, I told myself it was efficiency. When decisions were announced that I'd already anticipated and quietly prepared for, I framed them as alignment. When my ideas were repeated by someone else 5 minutes later and received with nods, I assumed coincidence. There's a particular invisibility that comes from being useful. You become part of the infrastructure. People step on you without realizing they're stepping on anything at all. I was included in emails when something needed to be fixed quickly. I was excluded when something needed to be discussed slowly. If there was a fire, I was looped in immediately. If there was a future, I heard about it later, sometimes much later. At performance reviews, the language was always warm and vague. We really appreciate everything you do. You're such a stabilizing presence. Everyone trusts you. Trust, I would later learn, is not the same as investment. I watched colleagues with louder personalities get opportunities to stretch, to lead initiatives they had never touched before. I watched titles change around me while mine stayed comfortably static, like a placeholder no one bothered to update. And still, I stayed. Not because I lacked options, I had skills, experience, leverage even then, but because I believed context mattered. I believed loyalty had weight. What I didn't realize was that I had been categorized early. Quiet, low friction, safe. I was the person you could rely on not to disrupt momentum, not to challenge optics, not to ask uncomfortable questions in rooms where decisions were already emotionally made. And once that story about you solidifies, everything you do is interpreted through it. If I raised a concern, it was framed as anxiety. If I offered an alternative, it was labeled caution. If I stayed silent, it was taken as agreement. They didn't see my restraint as intentional. They saw it as a default. I remember one colleague joking, "Nora could probably run this whole place." Everyone laughed. I smiled. The conversation moved on. No one paused to ask why that idea sounded absurd and flattering at the same time. That's who I was to them. The capable constant, the emotional neutral, the one who would always be there, smoothing edges, absorbing impact, making sure nothing broke loudly enough to cause discomfort. And for a long time, I let that be enough. Because I didn't yet understand the cost of being easy to overlook. I didn't yet see how being dependable without being visible slowly teaches people that you are replaceable, long before you actually are. At least that's how it began. The first moment didn't announce itself. It never does. There was no meeting, no raised voice, no email marked urgent. Just a small, almost polite deviation from what I had come to expect. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of day that feels structurally identical to every other one. Same desk, same mug cooling beside my keyboard, same low hum of Slack notifications that never quite stop. We were rolling out a revised onboarding process for a new client segment, one I had spent weeks mapping, documenting, and stress testing quietly in the background. I wasn't leading the rollout. That wasn't unusual. But I was supposed to be in the meeting, or at least I thought I was. I found out about it afterward. Someone forwarded me the notes with a casual FYI in case this impacts your workflows. I scanned the document and felt a brief, disorienting pause, like stepping down one stair too few. My name appeared nowhere, not as a contributor, not as a point of contact, not even in the acknowledgments at the end. What caught my attention wasn't the omission itself, it was the language. They had described the process as newly developed, recently designed, iterated collaboratively. The steps were mine, almost word for word. Even the phrasing felt familiar. But the origin had been erased, replaced by a collective fog where responsibility diffused upward. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself attribution was less important than outcomes, that the work existing in the world was what counted. Still, I noticed how my chest tightened, not with anger, but with something quieter. Recognition delayed is one thing, recognition redirected is another. Later that afternoon, I asked my manager about the meeting. Lightly, neutrally. I framed it as curiosity, not concern. She smiled and said, "Oh, we kept it small, just a quick alignment thing." Then after a beat, "But don't worry, everyone knows you're involved." That sentence did a strange thing. It closed the conversation while pretending to open it. Everyone knows. Then why wasn't I there? I didn't push. I nodded, took notes. and went back to my desk. That night, I rewrote part of the process documentation, not because it needed it, but because rewriting helped me think. I added version numbers, dates, quiet markers of authorship that no one had asked for. I didn't know why I was doing it yet. I just knew I wanted a record. Over the next few weeks, similar moments appeared. A decision was made without my input that directly affected my workload. A stakeholder looped in instead of me to streamline communication. A presentation deck using my frameworks, delivered by someone else while I watched from the back of the room. Each moment on its own was dismissible, innocent, understandable, the kind of thing you risk sounding petty for mentioning. And that's the genius of small cuts. They rely on your good faith to stay silent. Other people didn't react because they didn't feel it. To them, nothing had changed. The machine still ran. The output still appeared. I was still pleasant, still responsive, still doing the work. But I felt something recalibrate inside me. Not loudly, more like a dial turning one notch to the right. I began to realize that my presence was no longer assumed in spaces where direction was set. I was becoming downstream of decisions instead of upstream from them, and no one had said a word about it. What unsettled me most was how easy it would have been to miss. If I hadn't been paying attention, if I hadn't trusted that small tightening in my chest, I might have mistaken these moments for random noise. Instead, I started noticing patterns. Who spoke when I didn't? Who summarized my points in language that made them sound like conclusions instead of observations? Who benefited from my silence without ever asking for it? I didn't confront anyone, not because I was afraid, but because I wasn't ready. Confrontation requires clarity, and I was still collecting data. The first small cut didn't make me bleed. It made me aware. And awareness, once it arrives, doesn't leave quietly. What's dangerous about subtle disrespect is how quickly it starts to feel routine. Not acceptable, just normal. Like background static, you stop trying to tune out because you've convinced yourself it isn't worth the effort. After that first small cut, I didn't become defensive. I became accommodating. I told myself this was a phase, a temporary reshuffling of responsibilities. Companies evolve, teams realign, people get busy. I filled in the explanations before anyone else had to. When meetings happened without me, I asked for recaps instead of asking why. When decisions landed on my desk already finalized, I adjusted my timelines instead of questioning the process. I learned how to phrase my concerns as suggestions, so gentle they could be ignored without friction. Just a thought. Happy to support whatever direction we choose. Let me know how I can help. Language shapes reality, and mine was shaping me into someone easy to overlook. I began to notice how often my role was framed in terms of support rather than ownership. I was no longer responsible for outcomes. I was helping with them. When something went wrong, I was consulted. When something went right, I was absent from the narrative entirely. There's a quiet humiliation in being indispensable, but not influential. People depend on you, but don't defer to you. They need your labor, but not your judgment. And I let it continue because I was afraid of being misread, afraid that asserting myself would feel disproportionate, afraid that naming the pattern would make me sound paranoid. So instead, I rationalized. I told myself I didn't want to manage people anyway. I told myself titles were political and I preferred substance. I told myself visibility came with a cost I wasn't sure I wanted to pay. Some of that was true. Much of it was self-protection disguised as principle. The more I normalized these moments, the more others did too. Humans take cues from each other. When no one objects, behavior becomes precedent. When no one names an absence, it stops being noticed. I watched newer hires get context I hadn't been given. I watched my manager seek input from people with half my tenure because they spoke with more certainty. I watched my calendar fill with execution work while strategy drifted further out of my reach. And still I performed. Not out of fear, but out of habit. I had been trained, subtly and over time, to believe that professionalism meant endurance, that dignity meant restraint. that if I stayed steady long enough, things would correct themselves. But systems don't correct themselves, they optimize. And what the system was learning was this: I would adapt, I would absorb, I would not push back in ways that caused discomfort. So the edges pressed in further. I remember one moment clearly. A cross-functional lead thanked the team for pulling together a complex transition. She named 3 people individually. All of them had contributed, yes, but none of them had designed the infrastructure holding the transition together. I was sitting 2 seats away. I felt something hollow open up. Not rage, not sadness, something colder. A realization forming fully for the first time. My absence in that acknowledgement wasn't accidental. It was consistent. And consistency is intentional, even when no one admits it. That was when I stopped asking whether the disrespect was real. I knew it was. The more important question became why I had been working so hard to make it understandable. I began to see my own complicity, not as a failure, but as a pattern. I had equated being low maintenance with being professional. I had confused patience with neutrality. I had assumed that because no one was actively harming me, I was being treated fairly. Quiet disrespect thrives on that assumption. It doesn't shout. It doesn't threaten. It simply reallocates space until you're standing on the margins of your own work. I haven't changed my behavior yet, not outwardly, but internally, something loosened. The story I'd been telling myself, that this was normal, temporary, unimportant, started to lose its grip. And once a justification stops convincing you, you can't unsee the cost of maintaining it. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to understand that I wasn't just being overlooked. I had been placed. Not officially, not in writing, but socially, emotionally, structurally. I had been assigned a role, and I was performing it perfectly. I was the reliable one, the one who would stay late without being asked, the one who would absorb ambiguity so others could feel confident, the one who translated half-formed ideas into executable plans and never asked to be credited for the translation. I was useful in a way that didn't threaten anyone. Once I saw that, everything else snapped into focus. Why was it looped in after decisions, not before? My feedback was welcomed when it solved problems, but sidelined when it shaped direction. Why did people feel comfortable speaking over me, but uneasy when I spoke with finality? My value was operational, not authoritative. And the role came with unspoken rules. I wasn't expected to challenge leadership, only to enable it. I wasn't expected to have an agenda, only to execute others. I wasn't expected to leave, only to hold things together. What startled me most was how much of this had been mutually reinforced. No one sat me down and said, "This is who you are to us." But every interaction taught me what was rewarded and what was quietly ignored. When I showed urgency, I was praised for dedication. When I showed perspective, it was reframed as caution. When I showed ambition, it was softened into growth potential. Potential is a word people use when they're not ready to offer power. I had become the person you trust with the details, but not the direction. The person who makes other people look good without making herself visible. And because I did it well, because I did it with grace, it hardened into expectation. There was comfort in this role, predictability, approval. I knew how to succeed within its boundaries, and that comfort made it dangerous. Because once a role becomes stable, it becomes invisible. People stop imagining you as anything else. I remember overhearing a conversation near the coffee machine. 2 colleagues were discussing a new initiative, and one of them said, "We'll need someone steady to support it. Maybe Nora can help." Help. Not lead, not design. Help. They said it without malice, without irony. They were assigning me the role they had always known me to play. And in that moment, I realized something that unsettled me deeply. If I didn't change something, this would be the rest of my career here. Not because I wasn't capable of more, but because I had made it easy for them to stop expecting it. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me still. There's a particular clarity that arrives when you see the shape of the box you've been standing in. You stop bumping into the walls accidentally. You start noticing how narrow it really is. I began to see how often I had preemptively edited myself, how often I had chosen the least disruptive phrasing, how often I had swallowed ideas because I didn't want to be that person, and I saw how that restraint had been rewarded, with more restraint expected. The role I was assigned wasn't malicious. It was efficient. It served the organization well. It served my manager well. It even served my colleagues well. It just didn't serve me. Understanding that didn't immediately tell me what to do next. But it did something more important. It returned agency to me. If a role can be assigned, it can also be refused. Quietly, strategically, on your own timeline. I haven't refused it yet. I was still learning how deeply embedded it was, but I stopped mistaking it for my identity. And once you separate who you are from the role others have designed for you, the next shift becomes inevitable. The shift didn't happen during a meeting. It didn't come from a confrontation or a sharp comment that replayed itself in my head afterward. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, so unremarkable that I almost missed its significance entirely. I was alone at my desk, the office quieter than usual, that soft midweek lull when most people were either in back-to-back calls or had stepped out for coffee. I had just finished untangling a small operational mess, one that no one would ever know had existed because that was the point. I closed the last ticket, updated the tracker, and leaned back in my chair. And instead of the familiar sense of relief, I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no pride, just a flat awareness that I had once again prevented a problem that would never be attributed to me, solved a complexity that would be forgotten by the end of the day. The absence of emotion startled me more than frustration ever had. I looked around the office, glass walls, muted colors, people moving with purpose from one room to another. I had been part of this environment for years, and suddenly it felt like a place I was visiting rather than inhabiting. That was the moment I realized I was emotionally ahead of my job, not disengaged, not bitter, just no longer anchored. I opened my notebook, the black leather one I'd been carrying for years, and flipped through pages I barely remembered writing. Timelines, process maps, observations written in the margins like questions to a future version of myself. When did this stop feeling mutual? Who benefits from my silence? What would change if I weren't here? Those questions had been accumulating quietly, waiting for a day when I would finally be still enough to hear them. What shifted that afternoon wasn't my opinion of the company. It was my relationship to the role I had been playing. I saw with uncomfortable clarity that I was no longer growing, only maintaining, preserving systems, preserving comfort, preserving an image of myself that was easy for others to rely on. And maintenance, I realized, is a choice. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine an alternative. Not a dramatic exit, not a triumphant promotion, but simply the possibility that I did not have to keep absorbing more than I was given. I didn't make any decisions that day. I didn't send any emails or update my resume or confront anyone. The shift was internal, almost imperceptible, but it was definitive. I stopped narrating my actions through other people's expectations. When a request came in late that afternoon, something urgent but poorly scoped, I didn't rush to fix it immediately. I asked a clarifying question instead. The world didn't end. No one was upset. The delay didn't cost anything meaningful. That surprised me. Later, when my manager asked if I could just take care of something quickly, I said, "I can look at it tomorrow morning." My voice was calm, neutral, not defensive. She paused, then said, "Okay." That was it. No pushback, no consequence. Just a quiet confirmation that some of the pressure I had been carrying was self-imposed. The shift wasn't about asserting dominance. It was about reclaiming authorship over my time and attention, about noticing how much I had been anticipating needs that were never explicitly stated, and how often that anticipation benefited everyone but me. That evening, As I packed up my bag, I felt something unfamiliar. Curiosity about my own future that didn't include this role by default. Not dissatisfaction, possibility. I didn't yet know where that curiosity would lead, but I knew one thing with certainty. I could no longer pretend that staying silent was neutral. Silence had been a choice. And now, so would everything that followed. That day didn't change how others saw me. It changed how I saw myself. And that was enough to begin. After that day, my silence changed texture. It was no longer the automatic response of someone trying to keep things smooth. It became intentional, measured, chosen. And because it looked the same from the outside, no one noticed the difference. I still spoke when necessary. I still delivered work on time. I still smiled in meetings. But I stopped filling the gaps that weren't mine to fill. I stopped translating confusion into clarity unless I had been explicitly asked to do so. I stopped volunteering context that others had not bothered to seek. To them, nothing had changed. To me, everything had. There's a misconception that silence is passive. In reality, silence can be a form of boundary setting so subtle it feels invisible. When you stop rushing to rescue every incomplete thought, people are forced to confront their own lack of preparation. When you stop preemptively solving problems, the shape of responsibility becomes clearer. At first, people mistook my restraint for availability. They assumed I was simply waiting. So they continued as before, looping me in late, asking for quick fixes, expecting seamless outcomes. I responded politely, professionally, and with limits. I'll need more context before I can advise on that. That timeline doesn't account for X. How would you like to adjust? I can support, but I won't be able to own this end to end. These weren't confrontations. They were clarifications. And clarifications change dynamics without announcing themselves. I noticed how often my earlier silence had been used as consent. Without it, people hesitated. They began to document things more carefully. They included more detail in their requests. Some even started inviting me into conversations earlier, not out of respect, but out of necessity. Still, the dominant interpretation was the easiest one. Nora's quiet, Nora's Sam is fine. That misinterpretation worked in my favor, because while others assumed I was static, I was observing. I paid closer attention to how decisions were made, not just what was decided. Who was consulted informally before meetings? Whose opinions were treated as directional versus optional? Which roles were protected during budget conversations, and which were described as flexible? Silence gave me space to see patterns I had been too busy maintaining systems to notice. I also began documenting differently. Not just processes, but interactions. Dates, context, who said what and when. Not with suspicion, just with accuracy. I wasn't building a case, I was building clarity. People often assume that if you're not speaking up, you're not thinking. They forget that thought doesn't require performance. In meetings, I stopped reacting immediately. I let ideas land without cushioning them. If something didn't make sense, I didn't rush to reframe it into something workable. I waited. Often, someone else would stumble over the same gap a few minutes later. That taught me something important. My earlier interventions hadn't been preventing chaos. They had been masking it. And masks, once removed, reveal more than they hide. No one challenged my quieter presence. In fact, some seemed relieved. I was less intense, they said, more easygoing. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was easier to deal with because I was no longer doing emotional labor on behalf of the room. This period wasn't dramatic. It was almost boring. But beneath the surface, it was decisive. I was recalibrating my relationship to the organization, testing how much of my value was intrinsic and how much was assumed. And what I found was unsettling. The system functioned not because I overextended, but because I had trained it to rely on that overextension. Silence, when chosen, becomes data. It tells you what happens when you step back just enough to let others reveal their expectations. By the time anyone realized something was different, I already knew far more than they suspected. What they never noticed was how much information reveals itself when you stop trying to manage perceptions. Because I wasn't rushing anymore, wasn't filling every silence, wasn't smoothing every edge. I had time. And time, when paired with attention, becomes leverage. I began to see the organization not as a collection of personalities, but as a system of habits. Patterns repeated themselves with mechanical precision. The same people spoke first in meetings. The same voices summarized decisions. The same names appeared on slide decks, regardless of who had done the groundwork. And just as importantly, the same names never appeared when risk was discussed. I started tracking this quietly, not obsessively, methodically. I noted which roles were framed as core and which were described as support during planning conversations. I watched how budget language shifted depending on the audience. I paid attention to how leadership talked about continuity versus innovation and who they associated with each. What became clear was this: I sat at the intersection of several functions, but belonged fully to none of them in the eyes of the organization. That made me flexible. And flexibility, I realized, is often mistaken for disposability. No one noticed that I had stopped offering unsolicited solutions. They simply noticed that things took longer. Those questions surfaced later in the process instead of being quietly resolved beforehand. They blamed coordination issues, bandwidth, external dependencies. They never traced the change back to me. Meanwhile, I was learning how decisions actually traveled. Not the official path, the real one. The informal check-ins before meetings, the side conversations that shaped outcomes before anything was written down. The way certain people were given context early, while others were brought in only after direction had hardened. I noticed, too, how often my role functioned as a buffer. I absorbed uncertainty so leaders could present confidence. I translated vague intent into concrete action so others wouldn't have to sit with ambiguity. I shielded teams from the consequences of half-made decisions. And because I did it quietly, no one realized how exposed they would be without that buffer. This wasn't preparation in the cinematic sense. I wasn't plotting an exit or collecting secrets. I was simply understanding the architecture of the place I worked in, how weight was distributed, where stress accumulated, what would happen if certain supports were removed. I also revisited my own work with fresh eyes. I audited processes I had built years earlier, looked at the documentation that no one else touched, traced dependencies that existed only because I had been maintaining them manually. There were entire workflows that lived in my head, relationships with vendors that bypassed official channels because it was faster that way, institutional knowledge that had never been formalized because no one had asked me to. I asked myself a difficult question. If I disappeared tomorrow, how long would it take for this to become a problem? The answer wasn't immediate, and that was part of the illusion. The systems I had built were resilient until they weren't. They relied on continuity, not redundancy, on memory, not structure. No one had noticed because nothing had broken yet. I also noticed how my reputation insulated others. When things went smoothly, it was assumed they always would. When they didn't, the first question was always operational, never strategic. The burden of explanation landed in familiar places, including mine, but now instead of absorbing that burden reflexively, I let it sit. I watched how discomfort traveled when I didn't intercept it, who felt responsible, who deflected, who scrambled. And I learned something essential. The organization didn't know what it knew through me. They just knew that things worked. This period was quiet, almost invisible, but it was the most active phase of my transformation. I wasn't disengaging, I was recalibrating, aligning my understanding of my value with reality rather than perception. I wasn't preparing to burn bridges. I was preparing to stop holding them up alone. By the time I finished this internal audit of systems, relationships, expectations, I had a clarity I'd never had before. Not about what I wanted to do next, but about what I no longer owed. And they still thought I was just being quiet. The reveal didn't come from a conversation. It came from a search bar. It was late afternoon, the kind of slow hour where the office feels suspended between productivity and exit. I was waiting on a file to upload and absent-mindedly scrolling through LinkedIn, not job hunting, not networking, just drifting. A habit I'd picked up during lunch breaks and forgotten to drop. That's when I saw it. A role, same company, same department. The title was slightly polished, but the responsibilities were unmistakable. Line after line mirrored my daily work. Process ownership, cross-functional coordination, stakeholder communication, system oversight. Even the phrasing felt familiar, like someone had skimmed my documentation and paraphrased it just enough to feel original. I read it once, then again, slower. And at the bottom, in small neutral font, were 2 words that landed with more weight than I expected. Immediate start. I didn't feel shocked. That surprised me. There was no spike of adrenaline, no rush of betrayal, just a deep, settling quiet, as if something I had already suspected had finally decided to stop pretending. I checked the posting date, recent. I checked the recruiter, external. I checked the location, flexible. They weren't backfilling a departure. They were planning one. The clarity was almost merciful. For weeks, I had been collecting data, patterns, behaviors, omissions. This was the missing piece that snapped everything into alignment. The meetings I wasn't invited to, the decisions that bypassed me, the gradual redefinition of my role from owner to support. This wasn't neglect, it was a transition, and I wasn't part of it. I closed the tab and sat there, hands resting on my desk, breathing evenly. I didn't screenshot it. I didn't forward it to anyone. I didn't even write it down right away. I just let myself understand what it meant. They had decided my role was necessary, but I wasn't. And somehow, that distinction hurt less than I expected, because it confirmed something I had already internalized. My value to them had always been structural, not personal. I was a function, not a future. That night, at home, I opened my notebook and wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. Under it, I wrote one sentence. This is clarity, not betrayal. I went back to the posting and read it again, this time analytically. I noted what they emphasized and what they omitted, how they framed the role as collaborative but not authoritative, how they highlighted adaptability without mentioning decision rights, how the responsibilities were expansive but the title carefully contained. They weren't looking for someone to change the system. They were looking for someone to maintain it, just not me. That realization stripped away the last of my doubt. There was no misunderstanding to correct, no conversation that would restore balance. Even if I confronted them, even if they explained it away, the trajectory was set. And the most important part, they thought I didn't know. That knowledge, private, unshared, was the leverage. Not in a dramatic sense, not as a weapon, but as a compass. From that moment on, every choice became simpler. I no longer had to guess where I stood. I no longer had to interpret mixed signals. The ambiguity that had kept me emotionally invested dissolved. I didn't change my behavior overnight. I continued to do my job, professionally and thoroughly, but I stopped optimizing for a future that no longer included me. I stopped investing emotional energy in outcomes I wouldn't be around to steward. And I stopped feeling guilty about it. The reveal wasn't that they were replacing me. It was that I had been preparing myself for this without knowing it. The quiet observation, the documentation, the strategic silence, all of it had been leading here. By the time I closed my notebook that night, I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad. I was clear. And clarity, once earned, doesn't ask permission. Knowing changes the weight of every option. Once I had seen the job posting, once I had let its existence settle into my body, I found myself standing at a quiet crossroads. Not the dramatic kind, no ticking clock, no ultimatum, but a mental one. Every path forward was suddenly visible, and none of them were theoretical anymore. I could confront them, schedule a meeting, ask direct questions, force transparency into a process that had clearly been designed to avoid it. There was a version of that conversation where they reassured me, explained it away as pipeline planning or contingency hiring. A version where nothing technically changed, but something subtle broke. I could also stay silent and wait, let events unfold, see how long it took before the posting turned into interviews, then into an offer, then into a calendar introduction that framed someone new as supporting me. I could collect severance, references, and a clean narrative. And then there was the option no one had presented to me, but which now felt unavoidable. I could choose my own exit. Not impulsively, not emotionally, but deliberately. This wasn't about pride. It was about authorship. For the first time, I saw clearly that if I stayed on their timeline, every outcome would be reactive. Even leaving would be framed as a response to restructuring, to change, to circumstances beyond my control. I would remain a supporting character in a story already being drafted without my input. That realization sharpened something in me. I didn't want to be dramatic. I didn't want to make a point. I wanted alignment between what I knew and how I acted. So I slowed down. I listed my options in my notebook, not as pros and cons, but as truths. If I confronted them, I would gain information, but lose leverage. If I waited, I would preserve stability, but surrender timing. If I chose my own path, I would accept uncertainty in exchange for control. Control doesn't mean power over others. It means power over yourself. I thought about my values, how much I had prided myself on integrity, on not burning bridges, on leaving places better than I found them. I asked myself whether choosing myself violated any of that. It didn't. What would have violated it was pretending not to know what I knew. The decision wasn't a single moment. It was a series of small internal confirmations. Each time I imagined staying quiet and hoping for fairness, something inside me tightened. Each time I imagined moving forward on my own terms, something loosened. That was my answer. I didn't decide to leave that day. I decided something more foundational. I would no longer plan my future around a place that had already planned around my absence. From that point on, every action became reversible except one, and I knew which one I was choosing. I would move in silence, I would protect my dignity, I would not announce my awareness. And when I left, it would be because I chose to, not because I had been managed out of relevance. The decision point wasn't visible from the outside. No one noticed a shift in my tone or my output, but internally a line had been crossed. I stopped asking, "What will they do?" I started asking, "What do I want to carry forward?" And once that question replaces the old one, there's no going back. Once the decision was made, I became very quiet, not in presence, but in intention. This was the phase where nothing outwardly changed, and yet everything was in motion. I didn't announce dissatisfaction. I didn't withdraw effort dramatically. I didn't signal that I was preparing to leave. I simply stopped orienting my life around their future plans. Silence, at this stage, wasn't about withholding information. It was about conserving energy. I began by separating what was mine to carry from what I had been carrying by default. I completed my responsibilities cleanly, on time, and without emotional surplus. I no longer stayed late to anticipate needs that hadn't been articulated. I no longer volunteered for initiatives that existed solely to demonstrate commitment. Commitment, I had learned, is not a performance. It's an agreement, and I was quietly renegotiating mine. Outside of work, I updated my resume, not as a reaction, but as a recalibration. I didn't frame my experience around titles. I framed it around systems built, risks mitigated, and continuity preserved. I described what I had actually done, not what my role had suggested. That distinction mattered. I also reviewed my finances with a steadiness that surprised me. I calculated the runway, adjusted savings, reduced unnecessary obligations, not because I was afraid, but because clarity invites preparation. I consulted no one at work, no confidants, no allies, not out of distrust, but out of respect for the process. This was mine. I didn't need validation. At the office, people continued as usual. Meetings came and went. the job posting remained live. Interviews were likely happening somewhere beyond my line of sight. Occasionally, I noticed a glance linger a fraction too long, a conversation pause when I entered a room, but nothing explicit. They still thought I didn't know. That asymmetry created a strange calm. When you're no longer trying to be seen, you're freed from managing how you appear. I stopped editing my reactions to maintain harmony. I responded factually. I asked questions without cushioning them. And because I wasn't emotional, no one perceived a threat. I also began to formalize what had previously lived only in my head. Documentation, process maps, access credentials, vendor contacts. Not as a gift, not as a trap, just as completion. I wanted to leave nothing ambiguous, nothing that could be framed as negligence. Moving in silence doesn't mean disappearing. It means aligning your actions with your exit before anyone else realizes there is one. I declined a new initiative that would have extended my scope indefinitely. I cited bandwidth. It was accepted without protest. That, too, was data. I noticed how easily the organization adjusted when I stopped absorbing excess. Tasks redistributed. Deadlines shifted. Minor friction surfaced. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to reveal how much I had been smoothing over quietly. And still, no one asked me directly what I wanted. That absence of curiosity was confirmation. During this time, I interviewed elsewhere, selectively, thoughtfully. I asked questions about decision rights, not just culture, about how organizations handled institutional knowledge, about what happened when someone became indispensable. Those conversations felt different, grounded, mutual. I didn't rush. I wasn't desperate. I had already reclaimed the most important thing, my sense of authorship. Moving in silence wasn't about secrecy. It was about dignity, about not narrating your growth to people who had already decided where you belonged. By the time the opportunity I wanted appeared, I was ready. Not because it saved me, but because I had already saved myself. They still thought I was just doing my job. And in a way, I was just not for them anymore. Consequences rarely arrive with announcements. They surface as inconveniences, as small disruptions that feel unrelated until they start to cluster. The first sign was a meeting that ran long. It was meant to be a quick sync, 30 minutes, tops. I wasn't leading it. I wasn't even central to the agenda. But as the conversation drifted, I noticed something subtle. Questions were being asked that used to be answered before they ever reached the room. Timelines were unclear. Ownership felt fuzzy. Someone suggested a workaround that conflicted with the dependency I had quietly managed for years. I waited, not to be strategic, just to see what would happen if I didn't intervene immediately. The room grew restless. People talked in circles. Eventually, someone said, "Maybe we should loop Nora in later to sort this out." I was already there. I clarified one point. Briefly, neutrally. The meeting ended shortly after. People thanked me as if I had arrived rather than withheld. That pattern repeated. Small delays, minor misalignments, questions that surfaced downstream instead of being preempted. Nothing alarming, just enough friction to register. What changed wasn't performance. It was an expectation. I noticed colleagues beginning to ask for more detail in their requests, managers double-checking assumptions, a few side conversations where people tried to reconstruct the context that used to flow through me effortlessly. And slowly, the atmosphere shifted from smooth to cautious. No one connected it to my internal decision. From their perspective, I was still present, still responsive, still professional. But I was no longer compensating for gaps that weren't mine to fill. The system felt it before any individual did. There was a moment, small, almost forgettable, when someone remarked, "Things feel more complicated lately." It was said lightly, half joking. I nodded and said nothing. The consequences weren't punitive. They weren't dramatic. They were simply the natural result of removing an invisible support. What struck me most was how no one framed these changes as a loss. They framed them as confusion, inefficiency, and transition, anything but dependency. It's easier to say a system is under strain than to admit it relied too heavily on someone it never fully acknowledged. I also noticed a shift in how people interacted with me. Subtle, but present. A touch more deference. A few more questions framed as consultations rather than requests. Not because my status had changed, but because the absence of my anticipatory work had made my judgment more visible. Ironically, I was being taken more seriously as I did less. Still, no one addressed the larger reality. No one asked if I was staying or growing or planning. The organization moved forward as if certainty were intact. That's the thing about quiet departures. The consequences begin long before the exit does. I remained calm, detached, but not cold. I didn't correct misattributions. I didn't reclaim credit. I simply allowed the environment to adjust to the version of me that no longer overextended. This wasn't punishment. It was truth surfacing. And truth, once exposed, has a way of demanding acknowledgement, even if no one is ready to name it yet. By the time they sensed something was wrong, they still didn't know what it was. The questions started indirectly. Casual check-ins disguised as concern. A manager asked how my workload felt these days. A colleague was wondering aloud if certain processes had always been this complex. The tone was curious, not urgent. They were feeling the absence of something they had never named. Meetings grew heavier, more people were invited, not because collaboration had increased, but because accountability had thinned. Decisions took longer. Follow-ups multiplied. The efficiency everyone had taken for granted began to look like an anomaly instead of a baseline. I watched this without satisfaction. There was no pleasure in being proven necessary. If anything, it felt strangely impersonal, like observing a weather pattern you had studied academically, now moving through the region. Someone suggested a retrospective. Another proposed revisiting ownership models. There was talk of tightening loops and increasing visibility, all reasonable ideas, all arriving late. At one point, my manager asked if I could help document some of the context around a system I had designed years earlier. The phrasing caught my attention. Help document. Not reclaim, not formalize. Help. I agreed. Not because I owed it to them, but because clarity mattered to me. I delivered clean, precise documentation, nothing withheld, nothing embellished. When I sent it, I felt a quiet finality settle in. They thanked me profusely. Compliments surfaced that hadn't before. Institutional memory, critical insight. We really couldn't do this without you. Those words, once flattering, now felt oddly misplaced, like applause after the curtain had already fallen. I realized then that even if they understood what they were losing, they didn't understand why. They framed the problem as a knowledge gap, not a relational one, a process issue, not a pattern, and that made it unfixable. You can hire for skills, you can document systems, you cannot retroactively build trust or reassign dignity. The job posting was still live. That was the quietest confirmation of all. If there had been a genuine desire to course correct, to reimagine my role, to acknowledge the mismatch, to invest differently, it would have required naming what had been happening. And naming it would have required vulnerability that the system wasn't designed to offer. Instead, they adjusted around the problem. People scrambled. Temporary fixes emerged. New meetings were scheduled to address issues that had once been handled silently. The organization adapted, slowly and imperfectly, and I prepared to leave. When the offer I wanted came through, it didn't feel like escape. It felt like alignment. The timing wasn't rushed. The terms were clear. The role acknowledged the kind of work I had been doing all along, without requiring invisibility as a prerequisite. I accepted without hesitation. Still, I didn't announce anything immediately. There was one more step, not for them, but for me. I needed to leave without heat, without spectacle, to exit in a way that reflected who I was becoming, not who I had outgrown. By the time I scheduled the meeting to give notice, the system was already wobbling, not collapsing, just off balance enough to notice. It was too late to fix it, not because they couldn't have changed, but because the moment for mutual recognition had passed quietly, and neither side could return to it without pretending. And I wasn't willing to pretend anymore. The conversation took place in a small conference room with glass walls and a view of the city that always looked calmer than it felt. I had booked it myself. 30 minutes. No agenda beyond a single sentence I had rehearsed only once in my head. I wasn't nervous. That surprised me. My manager arrived with her laptop and a polite smile, already halfway into another day. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, weather, schedules. The hum of normalcy often cushions difficult moments. Then I told her I was resigning. There was a pause, brief but telling. Not shock exactly, more like recalculation. She asked why. I answered honestly, but selectively. I spoke about alignment, about growth. I wanted to step into a role that matched the scope of work I had been doing for some time. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list grievances. I didn't mention the job posting. I watched her face as she listened. Concern surfaced, then surprise, then something like regret, but not directed. She told me I was valued, that my work had been essential. The timing was unfortunate. She asked if there was anything they could do to change my mind. That question hung in the air longer than the others. I considered it. Not performatively, genuinely, because it deserved that respect. And then I said no, not because there was nothing they could offer, but because anything they offered now would be reactive. A response to loss, not an investment in presence. And she nodded slowly, as if she understood more than she was saying, or perhaps as if she understood just enough. We discussed logistics, transition plans, timelines. She asked if I could help onboard someone new. I said I would ensure a smooth handoff of my responsibilities during my notice period. No more, no less. There was no argument, no emotional appeal, no attempt to rewrite history. The conversation remained calm, professional, and almost subdued. That was the strangest part. This was the moment that months earlier would have terrified me. The imagined confrontation, the fear of being misunderstood or dismissed, and yet here it was, quiet, contained, finite. As we stood to leave, she said something that stayed with me. I wish we'd known you were feeling this way. I looked at her, not defensively, not sadly, and said, I don't think it would have changed anything. I didn't say it to be unkind. I said it because it was true. Knowing requires listening, and listening requires curiosity. Neither had been present when it mattered. The days that followed were respectful, but distant. Word spread quickly, as it always does. People expressed surprise. Some expressed disappointment. A few asked what I was moving on to. I answered politely, vaguely. This wasn't about comparison or justification. There was no dramatic exit, no farewell speech, just a gradual disengagement from systems I had once held together. And in that quiet departure, I felt something settle into place. Not triumph, not vindication. Completion. I used to think that leaving would feel like release, like stepping out of a room that had grown too small and finally being able to stretch. In reality, it felt quieter than that. More grounded, less like escape, more like arrival. Who I am now isn't defined by contrast to who I was then. That's important. I didn't leave angry, and I didn't leave to prove a point. I left because I no longer needed to negotiate my worth internally while presenting calm externally. In my new role, the work looks familiar, but the posture is different. I'm invited into conversations early, not as a formality, but as an expectation. When I speak, people pause, not because I'm loud or forceful, but because they've learned that I don't speak unless it matters. That took time to trust, on my side too. For a while, I caught myself reverting to old habits, over-preparing, anticipating needs before they were named, softening my language so it would land gently. The instinct to disappear into usefulness doesn't vanish overnight. It loosens gradually, with repetition and reinforcement. What changed most wasn't how others treated me. It was how I treated my own signals. When something feels off now, I don't override it with logic. I don't tell myself I'm being sensitive or impatient or ungrateful. I pause. I observe. I ask one quiet, clarifying question, either of the situation or of myself. Am I being invited into this fully or only for what I can absorb? That question has become a compass. I no longer confuse calm with compliance or professionalism with silence. I've learned that you can be composed and still be decisive, that you can be generous without being self-erasing. There's no bitterness here. I don't speak badly of my former workplace. It gave me years of experience, and it also gave me a lesson I wouldn't have learned any other way. That being indispensable is not the same as being respected, and respect without voice is fragile. I'm still quiet. That part of me didn't change, but my quiet now has edges. It's deliberate. It belongs to me. When people ask what changed, I don't offer a story. I don't recount the job posting or the slow erasure. I simply say I learned to listen earlier to myself. And that's true. I'm more selective now about where I invest my energy, about who gets my full attention, about what kind of environments I agree to be shaped by. I understand something now that I didn't then. If a system benefits from your silence, it will encourage it. Not overtly, not maliciously, just enough to keep you in place. The responsibility to step out of that pattern is uncomfortable, but it's also clarifying. Who I am now is someone who doesn't wait to be seen before acting in alignment. Someone who understands that quiet dominance isn't about control over others, but about refusing to abandon yourself for the sake of smoothness. And that has made all the difference. There's a temptation at the end of stories like this to offer a neat lesson, to condense months or years of quiet erosion into a single directive. Speak up sooner, know your worth, leave at the first red flag. But real life isn't that clean, and neither was this. What I learned didn't arrive as advice. It arrived as recognition. Recognition that systems rarely announce when they've stopped investing in you. Recognition that being valued for your reliability can slowly become a way of being contained. Recognition that silence is not neutral when it's expected of you, but it can be powerful when it's chosen. There was no villain here, no moment where someone twirled a metaphorical mustache and decided I was expendable. The shift happened through comfort, through habit, through assumptions that went unchallenged because they were convenient for everyone involved, including me. That's the part we don't talk about enough. How often do we participate in our own diminishment because it feels safer than disrupting the story others have written about us? How professionalism can quietly become self-erasure when it's not paired with agency. This story isn't a warning against loyalty or patience or restraint. Those are strengths, but like all strengths, they need context. Without it, they get repurposed. The moment I stopped trying to be understood by people who had already decided who I was, everything became simpler. Not easier, simpler. I stopped negotiating my value in rooms that benefited from my doubt. And when I left, I didn't take satisfaction in the disruption my absence caused. I took satisfaction in leaving without bitterness, without spectacle, without compromising who I wanted to be next. Quiet dominance isn't about winning. It's about alignment, about choosing yourself without needing to announce that choice to anyone who wasn't listening when it mattered. If you're in a place right now where things still work, but something feels subtly off, where you're relied on but not invited, trusted but not invested in, I hope this story gives you language, not urgency. You don't need to act today. You don't need to burn anything down. But you might need to start observing, documenting, listening to the moments you've been explaining away. Because clarity doesn't shout, it waits. Before we end, I want to ask you one open question, not as a prompt, but as an invitation. Have you ever realized that your silence was being mistaken for consent? And if so, what did you choose to do with that realization? If this story resonated with you, I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments, not to compare outcomes, but to recognize patterns quietly together.